everyone. So yes, it's my pleasure to share with you a few ideas this afternoon. And with Lisa, we selected to discuss the topic of access to multidisciplinary cancer treatment. And multidisciplinary is important because cancer is treated with drugs, but it's also treated with radiation oncology and with surgery and eventually even other modalities. So I think it's important to understand how all this can come efficiently in the healthcare system to the patient. So what I would like to cover with you in the next 30 minutes or so, I hope I'm checking the time, so that we have room for discussion, is of course maybe tell you just a little bit about DDORTC so that you understand why I'm here and what I'm discussing about, a little bit the role of independent clinical research in society. I will mostly discuss about the concept of what we refer to treatment optimization and give some example, but because I think it's important to give some example. And based on this, maybe share with you some ideas how we could eventually re-engineer the system and this continuum from early development into access. And of course, maybe try to think how we can put forward some ideas for our society in the future. So first of all, maybe just to tell you about the DDORTC. So we are a not-for-profit, non-governmental cancer clinical research organization. Indeed, the organization has 60 years of existence, and basically it's a clinical research organization, so generating data sets which hopefully over time and still today continue to change practice with the specific mission of survival and quality of life. And the organization has become a reference for, especially for methodology of cancer clinical research. And in that respect, we have a lot, of course, of partnership and consultation. So it represents about 45 clinical trials open at any time in 40 countries, and it's recruiting capacity of around 3,000 new patients every year on these clinical trials. So just to tell you a little bit what we are talking about, I would like to illustrate that what I'm referring to as pragmatic clinical trials, as public health clinical trials, because something that for me is always a concern is that when people think about the randomized clinical trial, they have a limited view that this is a registration trial. So a randomized clinical trial can be something else than purely a registration trial. So you will see different examples in there. So you will see, for instance, on the left-hand side, really trials looking at, for instance, quality of life in brain tumor. You will see trials, for instance, which look at comparing surgery and radiation oncology. You will have trials that look at combination of drugs and radiation oncology. We have clinical trials in very, very rare cancers that are extremely few in Europe that represent unmet needs. You will see also, for instance, on the top, a typical trial, the MINDAC trial in breast cancer that has been a de-escalation trial, actually, who should not receive chemotherapy. And you will see big achievement trials that potentially can those contribute, of course, to registration. So that's the type of trial we are doing in such an organization. Again, frequent tumor, rare tumor, and that's what we are going to talk all about. So first of all, a little bit setting the scene and setting the problem. I think that when we look at the societal balance, there is clinical research that is done, of course, by the for-profit sector, and it is very much needed. And we are, of course, we have large partnerships. It's very important to bring innovation to patients. There are, of course, research that are supported by the public sector, by the government, often at the national level. And then you have the non-for-profit sector, which actually is there, like the organization like DDORTC. And it's true in any field where the non-profit sector is active, which is there a little bit to complement and to also contribute to the societal output. And in our case, actually, how we can sustain access to therapeutic progress. And because we are in a very rapidly changing environment, I think we have to a little bit rethink how this, I would say, triangle can be re-equilibrated and how together we can potentially build a new ecosystem at a time when we have basically to rethink everything we are doing and unlearn what we've been doing to reinvent a little bit how we can do things. So something that is important also to get started is, and I often refer to this Canadian hockey player that is so good. He was asked basically, how come you are so good? But basically he says, I don't skate where the puck is, but where it should be in the goal. So I think for us, the goal is the patients. And something that is very important for an organization like DDORTC is to have actually more patient-oriented science, more patient-oriented clinical trial. And we have had in the recent years, and again, don't get me wrong, we need to bring innovation as soon as possible to the cancer patient. But I think we need to have a good balance, because any accelerated approach has the potential to bring innovation faster to the clinic, but also with certain uncertainty, which we have seen may have some examples, some negative consequences, or sometimes innovation is not really confirmed in the real life in terms of meaningful endpoint for the patient, being survival, being a quality of life. So how can we reinvent ourselves and potentially actually I would say structure in the continuum of access, maybe more independent research that could address more societal-based questions. And in that case, how should we rethink our policies and our society around that? So that's a little bit the problem statement. Now, coming to the concept of treatment optimization, just to put it in the process. So of course there is the process which is very well known by everyone of drug development and market access. But when a drug is on the market, usually for a couple of indications, there are many questions. Do we have the optimal combination? Because usually an existing strategy exists. Often the dosage is not really optimized, or the sequence of the duration of the treatment is not really optimally documented. So all these are potential trials which would lead to de-escalation. Sometimes, of course, also we are missing information about benchmarking against what exists. And again, there are some specific population, for instance, elderly patients, which are often not addressed. So this leads to many questions to optimize the treatments once they are available. And what we realize is that if the treatments are not optimized, they have a certain weight in the healthcare systems. And of course, how can we give optimal access if we don't know the optimal dosage, if the duration is not well documented? So how also by optimizing the treatment, so patient first, we could have also an impact on optimizing, for instance, the healthcare systems. Potentially, we are over-treating many patients in countries which have access to innovation, and in poorer countries which may not have access, then patients are under-treated. So how can we a little bit rethink that, especially in the EU 27, so that we have better access, maybe better control of the cost, and also have potentially more harmonized guidelines and cancer control plan. So we have postulated that between clinical science in early development, regulatory science, which is changing very fast, and we believe we have a very agile regulator that is trying really to adapt to the changing environment. But nevertheless, there is a pragmatic gap, which what I could refer to HTA access. So I unmute myself. I hope you can hear me. Yes, can you hear me? Can I check?
Yes.
Okay, so we believe that between the regulatory science and the access science, there are a number of data sets that are missing, and we need to make sure that these data sets are produced to inform actually those who give access, but also the patient, the doctor in the field about how to actually who benefits and how to administer this all this treatment. And typically, this is the type of agenda I've been presented to you is really to try to understand how to bring innovation into the whole armamentarium, into the context of the whole armamentarium, but again with the appropriate information. I cannot get to my next slide. I will try this way. So, and this is an issue, especially in the healthcare system, because I think it's a good problem to have. But there are many more new drugs coming to the market. These drugs are very expensive, and actually, if we do not know how to use them optimally, of course, they will bear a certain weight on society. So we believe we are at a time where we have to rethink a little bit how we are going to address these issues. So it's a good problem to have, but again, there are potentially some practical consequences. So I think it's important to also to exemplify that. I've been giving you some example of clinical trial where we come from, but I would like to share with you a couple of ideas, but I could have many more. And I've taken an example that we've been discussing recently with our breast cancer group. For instance, a question would be, can we identify those patients with high-risk triple-negative breast cancer that would not need 1 year of immuno-oncology in this setting? So basically, you would see that you could, for instance, approve immuno-oncology into the early stage, into the really early stage of breast cancer. You could randomize, so you give, in that case, immuno-oncology before surgery, and the question whether you would continue. So you could have this type of randomized clinical trial, which obviously is a de-escalation trial and may not, and we understand that, may not necessarily in the best interest of the commercial sector, but would be very important for the patient and for the healthcare system. So the expected impact of such a clinical trial would be to optimize the adjuvant treatment, spare women from toxicity of 1 year of treatment, and of course spare society at the level of the healthcare system. And just without any rocket science, and I'm not an health economist, but if you look at the epidemiology of the disease, and in this case, we had numbers only in the EU28. If you look at the cost of immunotherapy, and if you could, for instance, save a certain number of patients from this too long treatment. So here it's typically a question about, can we optimize the duration? You can lead to extremely substantial savings at the level of the EU. So see, this type of new approaches where we believe that if we ask the right question, if we generate the right data sets, then potentially everybody would benefit, the patient and society. So again, make sure that access to innovation, of course, is rapid, but then let's plan rapidly what needs to be done to optimize it, and of course adapt. We'd like to give another example that we are discussing with also our genitourinary group in prostate. And basically, here the question is also, it's not really a duration, it's more a sequence. It's intermittent treatment for hormonotherapy, and basically all the guidelines, all the observation really point in the direction that in this patient population that represent, in that case, the metastatic prostate cancer patient, which represent quite, of course, a substantial part of the cancer, potentially there would be benefit for giving intermittent treatment. At this point in time, there have been 7 trials, all use continuous administration for registration, despite, of course, a quite substantial toxicity profile in terms of treatment emerging adverse event, and an increased cost. And there is so far no study that look at de-escalation intermittent settings. So we believe that this type of question we could be doing in the healthcare system relatively pragmatically, again, to inform the healthcare system that voilà, it's possible, and to the patient saying it's possible to give you treatment in a more efficient way. So a little bit to make a stop here. What we have been discussing, especially at the policy level, is whether this concept of treatment optimization, so the generation of data sets that are not necessarily there at the time of marketing approval, could be done a little bit more in an independent way, because indeed sometimes there will be they may not be necessarily in the best interest, but that would be inform the healthcare system and the patient on this critically missing information. I think it could actually position in complement of what the commercial sector is doing, and which again we need, and is excellent job, no doubt about that. But again, if you remember the triangle that I tried to explain a little bit at the beginning, how can we find a better balance for all of us, actually all the stakeholders at the level of the society have certainly a better outcome of what we are doing. And if we could think about I would say a fluid process of this continuum where, again, around marketing authorization, there could be a mechanics, some new system to make sure these questions are addressed and solved, then potentially we position the stakeholders in this continuum at the right time so that they can take the right question, and at the end of the day, all stakeholders have contributed to their share in making actually a new treatment available, optimizing it, and making it and ensuring access to it. So of course, for this, we need to make some proposal. It's good to say we have a problem, but what can we do about it? And something that we think is potentially a route to follow is that we see at least three type of discipline that could come around this point of marketing authorization. I will start by the last one. The first one is health economics, because it's an important dimension, because again, at the end of the day, we want to make it accessible to as many patients as possible at least in the EU. We believe that we need to involve the epidemiologists, because the diseases are changing very fast based on the biomarker fragmentation and so on. So I think we need also to understand that. And last, we need clinicians and clinical research, and I will come back to that a little bit, because these questions may need different form of clinical research. Maybe it will need a prospective randomized clinical trials, like the first example that we believe would address basically the uncertainty, and will give some assurance in benchmarking, for instance, a schedule or a dose. But maybe there will be other form of clinical research. Can it be cohort? Can it be registry? That will take forward a different question. So I think we would need to also address what is the questions, or what are the 2-3 questions that are critically needed, and actually how we are going to address them. And there is, of course, the solution can vary, but at the end of the day, it's generate datasets that are informative, again, to patient, clinician, and society. So again, if you remember also this arrow with the optimized, the applied clinical research, treatment optimization questions, maybe we could have this checkpoint at some point in time very early would help actually raising raising the questions, and maybe also thinking a little bit differently the other way around, instead of thinking always from left to right, so basically developing drugs and bringing them to the market. Also maybe looking what are the unmet needs, what are the questions we have in real life. But is it a duration question? Is it a biomarker? And do we want to optimize biomarker? And then mandate research to address this question. So I think we have to work in a more bidirectional manner, and again based on maybe different type of partnerships between the different stakeholders, between the commercial sector, the non-commercial sector, the regulator, the HTA bodies, and the payers. And I think there is room here that we address that together to rebalance that. And I refer a little bit to a reverse continuum, where again the critical question in the field would drive actually research. So of course this is not easy because we live in a relatively busy environment and complex environment. And actually for an organization like DDORTC, where again you optimize treatments which are available, basically you fall in the gap between what is supranational in Europe, so what is an European competence, and basically what belongs to the countries. So what is a national competence, and typically, so registration is a supranational competence, but access is a national competence. And here, there is a gap. So that's the first thing. Second, there are many initiatives currently in the European Union, and it is good. We have so many opportunities, so many, I would say, different approaches that are being there, whether they are actually cancer sector specific, so cancer specific or non-cancer specific. So certainly the cancer mission, the cancer beating plan, but we also have, for instance, the pharma strategy or the European health data space. So how all this is going to change our environment in the future, and again, how can we subscribe the concept of treatment optimization in this all changing environment and new opportunities. The other thing that is important, and I alluded to that, is of course that we live also in a relatively complex regulatory environment. So we have here also a non-sector specific regulation, which is the GDPR, but we are going to have, as of next year, gradually new sector-specific regulation, like the clinical trial regulation, the medical device regulation, the artificial intelligence regulation will come in the future. And we have also new forms of trials. I've alluded to that, again, real-world data, cohorts, and so on and so forth. So the question a little bit, if we want to change that, is who is in charge in this? Is it the regulator, which does its job and then has to pass it on? Is it in the country? Is it at the level of the European institutions? So all this is a little bit a complex environment where we certainly have to try sometime to find our way, and it's not easy. So my question, the question that I always ask, is that if we don't aim to that, if we don't aim to making things available in a pragmatic manner for the patient, based on relevant endpoint to the patients, based on the questions informing, again, essential question like how long you should be treated, or are you part of the right population to start to go receive this treatment? Then the question is, are we truly patient-centric in Europe? At this point in time, I think our system are still relatively drug-centered, because of course it's mostly about drugs. Radiation oncology is less regulated, but to some extent it's the same issue. So I think we should develop the means, if we really want to become patient-centric, to really develop these data sets that can inform optimally the treatment of patient. Again, integrating different disciplines, again, unlearning to relearn what we have, what we've been doing, reorganize a little bit, re-engineer these maybe models of partnership, how we can all contribute, because all the stakeholders are very important, and again, address these gaps into this process of clinical science, regulatory science, and health technology assessment. So again, maybe see how can public health priorities actually can command this research, because actually if those who give access have questions and cannot give access, or maybe again in Europe have different views, can they get together and ask the question to be clarified, to give access? And again, the last thing I want again to re-emphasize is the fact that often we speak about drugs, because that's where indeed a lot is maybe happening. But again, if we are really truly cancer patient centric, then we should speak about all the modalities, because all the modalities are important for the cancer patient, and 50% of the cancer patient in the early stage of disease, for instance, to receive radiotherapy. And I think it is as important, because if not even more important, because that's where we can still cure potentially the patients. So voilà, so this is my last slide, because I think I wanted to keep quite a bit of time and still remain at a high level, and we can go in more details during the discussion. But I think that we are certainly in a transformative societies. I've been in myself in the field for almost 30 years, and certainly we don't do the same clinical trial. We are not, the partners are not asking the same thing. The economic environment has changed. So I think we really have to unlearn what we have done, because if we don't unlearn, it's very difficult to learn to do things differently, and to try to think along completely new concept like re-engineering what we are doing. And I think we should aim to reach a process to really perform efficiently, widely applicable clinical research in the best interest of continued therapeutic progress, and of course centrally to preserve the patient's interest and rights. And with this, I believe this is my last one. Yes, I thank you for your attention, and I hope we can have a good, very rich discussion. I think, Lisa, you asked me to unshare my screen so that we can have the discussion. So I will stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denis. So I would appreciate if you turned your cameras on so we can see you when you ask questions. So the floor is open. So who would like to go first? Denis, I'll start with the first question. Such a vast experience that you have in the field and actually been in the same field. What is your assessment? Do you think we've been moving at an all right pace in terms of improving quality of clinical trials or getting to the right clinical trials? Or are we too slow, or we haven't nearly done as well as we should have done? And will it take another 30 years to get to what you're describing? So what is your assessment? Sorry, just a clarification. Of course, we've done a lot in terms of innovation and development. So my question is about this field in terms of pragmatic clinical research.
What I think is that, again, when I started my career, I was doing phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. That's it. Okay, that was basically the only thing we had. Today, we have, of course, still phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, but they look differently. Phase 3 are much more difficult because they are sometimes too big. So they are less numerous, but we have other forms: basket trial, umbrella trial, platform registry, cohorts, real-world data, and so on. And what I think we are missing, and maybe here we are not doing it well, is to really understand what we can get out of each of these solutions. And I think we have created many different approaches, different methodologies, which we sometimes don't know how to use optimally. And I think here it's at the same time a progress, but I think we are not going the end of what we can do with that. Like when I started, I said, I hear often people saying randomized clinical trial versus real world data. To me, it doesn't make sense, because real world data is a resource of data, and you can get there through different ways. You can do you can randomize your patient in real life, in the healthcare system. You can do a very pragmatic trial in the healthcare system. So I think the people sometimes confuse randomized clinical trial, and they point at the randomization when the problem is actually the complexity of the eligibility criteria. So you can randomize based on a couple of eligibility criteria, for instance. So I think we have to understand what we can do with all these methodologies, and at which point in time in the drug development, in this whole continuum.
Thank you, Denis. John, go ahead. John, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Thank you for a very nice talk, Denis. I think it's really important what you're doing, looking at, for example, decreasing the dose, changing the protocols, and so forth. Protocols which are largely determined by trials run by the pharmaceutical industry. And I wondered how you think you might measure the impact of what you're doing. So when you run a trial and it comes out looking like it's better to reduce the dose or to reduce the time of treatment, how do you deal with the lock-in of the oncology community to the data that's come from pharmaceutical company trials? And do you think are there other ways for you to measure that, how successful you are?
Well, so far, so I hope I get well your questions. Well, as an organization, we have been doing these trials for decades, so we know that these trials are feasible and they can change practice. So in that respect, we have this track record and we can document that it is feasible. The question that the issues that we have, I would say, in the current environment is the fact that, and I don't want to talk about price because I'm not an expert and it's not my problem to some extent, but the fact that drugs are become so expensive is an issue to run these trials. So the problem that we have now is, are we going to be able to do as many of these type of trials in the future because of the cost of the drugs? Mm. So I don't know if I take your questions. I'm not 100% sure.
Well, it's really how you measure the impacts and how you get the information when you run a trial that differs from the accepted trial to which many oncologists are locked into because of a trial that was run by a pharma. And that's what the data was approved by the agencies. How do you know, and maybe you do over all this time, the impact of what you're doing? How do you transfer that information to the payers and the patients so they put pressure on the oncologists to change protocols?
Yeah.
As I said, they're very often locked into.
Yeah, so at this point in time, this is what we are trying to address, is what can we change actually to make sure we see how these data sets can be acceptable by society. But at this point in time, again, we really have, especially in the, I would say, in the new environment, to make sure we can continue these activities. And for instance, if we could at least take one of these questions, like the one I've shown, and pilot it in the current environment with the HTA body, look at the outcome, and then from this point of view, see how it's going to impact on access. I think that's what we need to do actually, is really to have a pilot where we would have all the stakeholders aligned and then we would see how together we can change that. So at this point in time, this is something we would like to do differently to assess actually how we can change that.
That's great. Thank you.
Lydia.
Yeah, I just want to go one step further and think, referring to the question of John, I think what you will need is implementation in the guidelines and really absorption by the oncologist. Let me give a very practical example from my own experience. I was treated with Herceptin for 1 year, and there were a lot of data out there that 6 months would be sufficient. And we even discussed that in the big group, all the different clinical trials that were done, but they were not good enough, yes, no, and I leave it. It's DDORTC is much more experienced in that. But then what you get is, there's no agreement amongst the oncologists about the quality of the clinical trial. So in the end, when I personally asked my oncologist, why should I have 1 year? Is 6 months really not sufficient? She was reluctant, and she said, yeah, but you know, the guideline and CISALA. And in the end, okay, I took 1 year, but I didn't take the anthracyclines, as you know, because there we agreed, although it was not in the guidelines, the data were sufficient. So I think, John, that is what you mean. I think if you do that type of studies, how can it be absorbed by the community, where you will have to really have a battle with what ESMO is saying, for example.
But I think that's exactly what and personally, I believe that why there is so much hesitation, because the data are not there. So people cannot tell you exactly. And I believe that, and we are actually talking with the ESMO, we are talking with EHA, also actually how the guidelines organization actually can also maybe say, we are missing in the guideline, this is missing, can we address that? So I think that's part of if you want, the reverse engineering as well. So going from what is missing in the field, what is missing in the guidelines, and generate the research to answer that. Now, of course, I have only the experience of the field of oncology and of the EORTC, our network of clinicians, but I can tell you, they come with this question to us. Can you help doing these trials, because with the data are missing? So they come from the field. These questions, they don't come from the EORTC central office in Brussels. They come from our groups. And you see the example that I've been showing you come from the breast, the GU, the GU ureter, the GU group, and so on. So they really come from them.
And Lydia, I think also another point, imagine that if actual evidence for Herceptin was that you need to be treated 1.5 years rather than half a year, that would be in the fantastic interest of Roche. So the guideline would probably been changed very, very quickly.
Be sure of that.
You were going in the wrong direction for them. And I think that's also quite an impediment. And also, I think maybe perhaps clinicians' perception saying, hold on, let's just overtreat rather than be sorry, and it's a huge harm as well. So, and uptake for something more rational, which needs to be used less, is difficult social issue, but much needed. So, all right, François, and then Frank.
Thank you very much, Denis. Sorry, I will try to ask my question despite having caught the Omicron COVID. So, Denis, it was very interesting. I wanted to ask you a kind of general question. What is the burden which is currently posed by the clinical trials regulations of the conduct of these studies? Because I understand that as sponsors of these studies, you have to pay for the treatments which go in these studies. So, would that be a kind of? Is there a case to have a much more a specific regulation for these studies to facilitate the conduct of these studies? And the second part of my question is how companies adopt your ideas, because they don't really have any clear interest to promote the conduct of these studies. So and without pharmaceutical companies, again, the financial burden becomes more and more difficult. So do you have any thoughts on that, Denis?
So for the first part, I would not advocate for different type of regulation because it would be too complex. It takes ages to have a new regulation. I would be more in favor of very pragmatic solutions. So for instance, if I take the example of a question about duration, of a treatment that is anywhere available in the healthcare system, a potential approach would be that the healthcare system, if they share the same concern, the same issues, maybe we could agree on a clinical trial or whatever form of clinical research that will address the question of this particular drug. And for instance, they would make available, they would give to the independent sponsor in that case, in anticipation of the second part of your question, because indeed this would not be supported by companies, but give the ticket for using, if you want, the supplies, so the healthcare system daily supplies to run a very pragmatic trial. So I would see more this type of approach. And of course, at the end of the day, when the data set is analyzed, the data set is shared and is public for people to take their decisions. What they want to do with this data set. But that's if I would have a magic stick, I would try to address something like that. And the second part of the questions, indeed, we have tried to approach companies for partnerships for this type of trials. But of course, it was, and we understand they have a certain business model, and I think what they do it well. But at some point in time, indeed, that's very difficult for them to support such type of initiatives, and especially that when you see now drugs reaching the market based on very small data sets, then once they are on the market, inevitably they are disincentivized to continue research. And that's where I say there is this big gap between the regulatory science and the access science, and I think we have to address it together.
Frank?
Yes, I also have a question for Denis. In fact, when you mentioned that the clinicians come to you with the questions, the open research questions, are these questions kind of predictable, or you have to wait until the product is on the market, or is it something that could already be addressed earlier on?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and so I've been discussing that a lot, actually with our network, but also with other stakeholders. And usually, the 2-3 questions can be easily identified very early. They know which are the 2-3 questions that they would need to optimally implement the treatment. So usually they can be anticipated. Yes.
Yes. Going further on that, because one of the policy recommendations of the report that will come out tomorrow on comparative evidence is that this should be already in the pre-market phase already, because we've seen all the failures in the post-market phase. And then, yeah, if like in oncology, these trials take a number of years before you have results. And yeah, when you have then results already, the new innovation is there. And so it's the sequencing is not perfect. Yeah.
Indeed. The earlier, the better.
Yeah. And then you made a very interesting comment in terms of we might see fewer trials because these drugs become unaffordable. And of course, if, let's say, a non-commercial organization wants to run it, they simply might not get access to the drugs. But it's also sounds like a very tragic scenario in a sense, because these drugs are in the system and they are taking even more resources by actually being in the system and not letting us figure out. So what do you think should be a solution? Do you think it's possible to do it through legislation where regulators are actually requiring companies to provide the drugs for free or at very reasonable prices for generation of this practical clinical evidence until, let's say, we're happy with the answers to inform clinical practice?
So I guess that's where my competence stop, I should say. And actually, I've been, and some of you know, we've been searching in the field. With whom should we talk about that in Europe to change that? And that's where you fall again into this gap between supranational, national, and I believe that we are not DDORTC, as we are not competent to do that. But what we are saying is that there is an issue. We are alerting. We can contribute to solving, but we need to discuss with others, whoever are the others, what we could be changed in Europe to address that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lydia.
Yes, along the same lines, thinking of solutions. I think solutions will need change in legislation anyhow, because I don't believe that we can change things on a voluntary base. That will be extremely difficult. But I know it's pure theoretically, but you could think of solutions that if the evidence at the time of market authorization is really limited and need optimization, you could think of conditional market authorization that makes that forces the companies, that incentivize them, to put it in a nicer way, to really support those follow-up trials. That's what's happening, for example, in some cases, not in all, unfortunately, with the CAR T cells. And then you get that conditional market authorization, and you need to already have an idea of what is called your post-authorization effectiveness study will be. And you could think along the same lines for optimization. But then I really think of course, those thinkings need a change in legislation. But I think now, where before 21st of December, where we can give feedback to the pharmaceutical legislation, those are the type of thinkings that slowly but surely should be put into the system, way of speaking. And even more advanced, I think, is the whole idea that is slowly growing, that there should be the research questions of HTA should be kind of absorbed by the scientific advice working party of EMA, to at least try to convince or to really again incentivize the market authorization, the app holders, that the design of what will be called the pivotal trials in the new regulation should really also try to answer the research questions of the HTA. But there, of course, you need the joint HTA, and you need the UNETA 21 group. I mean, it's all maybe far future, but we have to start somewhere with, as Denis rightly say, we have to reverse the thinking. And we have to start off on the research questions and then go to the trials, and not the other way around. That I think I fully agree. Maybe I'm somewhat more extreme in that whole reverse engineering than what Denis is presenting. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
No problem. It's good.
So Frank, yeah.
Yeah, actually, continuing on that, it could be an idea and that is actually the recommendation that will be made, is to only have a definitive marketing authorization when the comparative evidence is there. Of course, this is not possible with the current framework. So that's why these recommendations are addressed to the member state governments and the European Commission, and not to EMA.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions, comments for Denis? I think what comes clear from this discussion, DDORTC is a very unique organization, actually being pan-European and being able to take on this role, but only in oncology, and only the very few organizations that can compare in this space. And I think what's happening, we have international drug discovery, we have international drug development, we have EMA, even HTA is trying to collaborate, so we get into this, but at the space of pragmatic trials, it's it's the national service that asks the question, and then sometimes it's the burden that is unliftable. And there are some questions which might be specifically of interest to, let's say, NHS in England or national service in France, but many questions, for example, Lydia's example of trastuzumab dosage or duration of treatment, vast majority with clinical questions are relevant across the border, and we do not have these cross-border collaborations, pushing these resources together. We're not agreeing of how we can do it, and if we did, it could have been a lot more efficient. And this is such a currently distributed system, and once again, if NHS runs a trial, should France adopt it? Why? So it's also an issue, and I think it's a huge gap, and the question is, who should resolve this gap? Should it be WHO? I wouldn't get into that direction. So, but it has to be this kind of international authority, and we managed on some level. So this seems to be this kind of mismatch of at one level and the other level, and that's why we don't see.
Because it's very important what you say, because for instance, we are discussing, of course, across Europe, but more specifically, I was attracted by a trial that the French are going to do, which compares also immuno-oncology in the adjuvant setting of non-small cell lung cancer, 6 weeks versus 3 weeks. So supported by the public national system. And I discussed with the French, but we all said actually we should have the possibility to do that immediately in an international setting, because the trial would be done much more faster. Everybody would a little bit contribute financially, and everybody would have the data sets.
And as right now, I think theoretically it's possible on some kind of voluntary basis, you know, directly connecting with clinicians that are interested in a game, but it's not enough. It's selective. It does not resolve the question. It could set examples. So huge policy issue that needs to be
maybe I want to say something positive, is that we've been discussing a lot, because at this point in time, the only official body to which we can refer is the regulator, even if it's not really in its remit. But the regulator has accepted to look at that. They realize the concern, and actually we are in the process now. I can disclose, because it's going to be launched next year, a cancer medicine forum. Led by academia, but supported by EMA to actually address this. So what can we do better in the vicinity of marketing authorization? But it will be a long-term, I would say, work, because all the questions you have discussed, where it should fit in scientific, can it go to scientific advice? Should it go in the conditional approval? Can we build on, for instance, this week there was the conclusion of the IPAC joint action, and work package 9 of IPAC actually has made exactly this type of observations. So how can we build on all that to make a difference? So I remain optimistic that gradually people come to the same observations. Certainly the work done in the country and the report that Frank is going to release is going to be helpful. So I think we are moving in the right direction, but it will take some time before, especially as Lydia mentioned, we need a new legislation. It will be a long term, but again, as you said, Lisa, if we never start, we get nowhere. Voilà. But what I'm sure is that DDORTC alone, we will not make it, because who are we? We are just a research organization. We have a scientific agenda. We are trying to inform as much as possible the field and making as many research programs as possible. But that's all what we are. It's just a research organization.
Thank you, Denis. Research organization was a very important example that you set for the world. So, Lydia?
Yeah, also maybe to end on a more positive note, I think I shared it with you, Lisa, that finally the International Council for Harmonization, which is, yeah, FDA, EMA, more broadly than just Europe, has, after years of discussion, agreed on how a clinical trial should be designed. It's called Excellence by Design. And I don't know, Denis, if you had the chance to look in that concept and into that idea, which at least from what has been presented within EMA and where I attended, it looked promising. But how do you see your the contribution of EORTC and along those lines of excellence by design and indeed patient-centered? They want to implement that, as I understood correctly, from 2024 on. Yeah. And it's now approved and made public. How do you see that evolving? Any ideas there?
Yeah, I don't want to sound too presumptuous, but it seems that that's what we've been doing historically at DDORTC, patient-centric and excellence, optimal designs, and so on. It's good that it's taken, but what is excellence? Actually, when sometimes you hear real-world data being discussed in all directions, here I question, where is the excellence?
Yeah. Lady, I think that's important initiative that at least this is tabled and recorded. Adherence to it is another question, because I think we're actually at the other end of the spectrum now. And if the study is completed of this next cure, as you can imagine, on a single arm trial, and FDA then says, hold on, but you are not, you haven't followed this ICH guideline. Is there any chance that guideline actually can overrule? And so we're yet to see. So it's good to know that at least it's coming. This being applied and this actually being enforced for the industry is a very difficult question. So I wonder how EMA and FDA actually use it as an instrument, and if they do at all. So
fully agree.
So we'll see, indeed. But it's interesting that at least there is, I would say, a collective understanding that, and that's why we have to be optimistic and build on all these things, actually.
Okay, so we're at the end of the hour. Any other comments, questions for Denis? Okay, so thank you so much for joining our last session. Denis, thank you for your excellent talk. We learned a lot, and a lot of work needs to be done, obviously. So those of you just starting your career, there's definitely ways to grow. So I wish you happy holidays. Hopefully you'll enjoy during the break. We're taking a few weeks off, and we'll be back in January with one mega event on cancer screening that John organized. So it's already on our webpage, so I highly advise you to take a look, and of course you'll get correspondence. So, and we have other events lined up for the next year. So look, seeing you back, and enjoy your holidays, stay safe, don't follow Francois' example. Let's hope you are the only one with Omicron on the screen. But otherwise, yes, have a good evening, and thank you.
Thank you very much, and happy holiday to all. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.